Hello, in this video I will dissect an Ascaris for you. It is an intestinal parasite of, well, all sorts of mammalian species. These are found in pigs. Similar worms can be found in people. Ascaris is a genus, and so there are a few different species of this genus. And this is in the phylum Nematoda. Now there's not a whole lot to see on the outside without really careful searching, so you should just be able to distinguish between the tail end, or the posterior end, which has the anus, and the anterior end, which has the mouth. Now it's kind of hard to tell, but the anterior end is usually, or the mouth end is usually pointier. It looks pointier, and it has 3 jaws on it, and the posterior end with the anus is a little bit blunter, and it just has a hole for the anus. Now these worms, commonly called worms or intestinal roundworms, have a cuticle, and this cuticle is tough and it needs to be shed as the worm develops. And these have longitudinal muscles, long muscles that run the length. Actually, it's more like muscle cells. They're not really like muscle tissue, but muscle cells, and when we open them up you won't be able to see them. But these move about in a thrashing motion. They're not like earthworms that can squeeze. They also have circular muscles that can squeeze their bodies closer or narrower and fatter. These can just thrash side to side. Okay, now this is a very simple dissection, and I'll begin by just pinning the ends down, and this may or may not be completely necessary, but I pin through the tail end and pin through the mouth end. There. Now the males will look very similar to females. They're usually a little bit shorter and the end is hooked. They'll have a hooked posterior end for copulation. Now in this one, the cuticle and everything is so thin and fragile that you can just poke a needle in and just tear, and I'm just going to go gently beneath the surface. So I'm not going to plow through the intestinal organs. I'll go gently beneath the surface and just make a cut inside, and then I'll peel back the skin and put the needles down and open up the inside. You can see things on the inside. Just go down an inch or 2 and then put some needles in. Well, I'm putting the needles in at an angle so they don't get in the way of our exploration of the internal organs. And there's not a lot to these things on the inside, to be honest. They, or at least that you can see. There is some complexity in their anatomy, but not a lot that we can see. Again, they have muscle fibers or muscle cells, contractile cells. They also have a nervous system that helps coordinate their muscle contractions. But there's no respiratory system. They have a very simple excretory system. And you will see that their digestive system is essentially just a long intestine. They open their mouths and they live inside of digested material, so there's no need for them to have a stomach or some place to churn or even teeth to break up the food, because they live in pre-digested food. So really they just need to absorb. They don't even have digestive glands to make digestive juices or enzymes. I'll get this almost all the way open. Now, different preserved specimens have different levels of what should I say, order left inside. Sometimes the preserved specimens, the insides are pretty much turned to mush. And this one looks like it's a little bit in between the mush and the non-mush. So what we see mostly is reproductive structures. The very finest of tubes, which are toward the posterior end, are the ovaries. And they look like long span. This one's all broken up. There are actually 2 tubes and they are all wound up and they are broken. So they have 2 ovaries and then 2 uteri, or 2 uteruses, and the uteruses will come together down toward the mouth end, or the anterior end, and form a V-shaped structure, which is the vagina. And I'm trying to find it here, and it is right here, but it's in a bad state of, it's very fragile here. So we have some oviducts, so the ovaries and oviducts. So it really just starts out as, it's one long tube, but it gets fatter and fatter. So it starts very, very narrow, and the very narrowest parts are the ovaries. Like this here, and then where the ovaries and the oviducts and the uterus begin, well, it's all just kind of gradual increasing in diameter of these tubes. So this here, where they come together, this is the 2 uteri, and this is the vagina. And it was connected to the outside here through the genital pore. And so the sperm can be received through genital pore when these worms actually copulate. So this is the vagina, this V-shaped structure, and then these 2 larger tubes are the uteruses, or uteri, and that's essentially it in terms of their reproductive structure. So these things, that's all they're made for, is just making fertilized eggs, making babies. They reproduce. This ribbon-like structure, which is a state of disintegration that runs the whole length. So here's a piece of it that's kind of attached to the, that is part of, this is the part of the intestine. And it's a thin ribbon that runs the length from the mouth to the anus. And here's another portion of the intestine. It's flattened out here, and it's very fragile, so I'm breaking it as I'm pulling it up. But that is the intestine. And there's lots of reproductive, the ovary and the oviducts. The intestine runs the whole length from mouth to anus. And so it just opens its mouth, takes in the food, and absorbs things from there. So in terms of internal anatomy, that there's what you can see, that's it. Reproductive structure and the intestine, if you're lucky that it doesn't fall apart. It's a ribbon shaped. It's shaped like a ribbon. But it's a tube, of course. Now, these worms have what's called a pseudocoelom. They don't have a true body cavity. So all these internal organs are not connected anywhere to the outside, anywhere along the length. They are completely separate, except for, of course, where the vagina connects to the outside through the little tube called the genital pore. But the intestine is separate from the inside. It's just completely loose. It is fluid-filled when they're alive, so they have a hydrostatic skeleton, so they're not completely flat, so they're kind of inflated with fluids. And that's about all there is to see. Now, the male, if we dissect the male, it would just be one long tube of testes and then seminal vesicle and then all the way down to the end. It's just one long tube to make sperm and then intestine. That's about it. So it looks a lot like this, except that there are just one tube and it doesn't come to a V anywhere. So that is the Ascaris.